Jock, if you could comment on the internal workings of the media. I've always wondered, how are the how are the articles chosen? Do individual journalists propose topics to write on or to speak on? And who guides whether they can comment on that or not internally? You know, does it come all the way down from Murdoch, or is it the senior editor? How is the front page chosen?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, since you asked me, thanks for the question, to comment on Ricardo's point, I'll just take a brief second to say that I agree with your conclusion, Ricardo, and another term for it would be self-censorship, that the media is gagging itself. I don't necessarily agree that all of the stories that you mentioned are conclusive evidence for your argument, because I think that they're out there, those stories, and some of the places you might have read them could have been from, you know, when you Googled those topics, could have been from the media. I'm sure the ABC has covered probably all of those, and many other media as well. But why do they not cover them a lot? Why are they not on the front page? So that comes to your question in a sense. And that's where things get a bit more complex. And Sean would know the same thing from working inside the media. It's about audience, because ultimately we're following the audience. But how do we find the audience? Well, before we had live statistics, which we have from online websites, so we know exactly who's reading a story, who's responding to a story, a system of news values developed. There's a few different interpretations of them, and different media outlets will have different emphases in news values, but things like conflict, timeliness, obviously, proximity. So that's one of the reasons that stories about African slave trades don't get a lot of mention in Australia, because we don't write much about African stories of any kind, because we don't care. And it's not that the media doesn't care. Actually, probably the media cares. You know, journalists, individual journalists might care a bit more because they know a bit more about the world as an occupational necessity. But Australians don't care about Africa. I think that would be a reasonable generalisation. Sorry?
They care about South Africa.
Garbage.
Well, they might.
That is absolute garbage.
It
And
could
the
be
other
garbage,
night there was a...
but some people care about Africa on some level, of course. It's not 25 people don't care about, million
No
people
one in
don't
the
care
ABC
about
cares
Africa.
about South Africa, let me tell you.
So, back
So why
to
is
news
it a
values
right-wing
and
conspiracy
proximity.
that white farmers are being murdered?
Proximity explains issues like that, and there's other news values like unusualness. So, you know, why do you not hear about things that happen in our everyday lives all the time? Because they're not unusual. If it's not unusual, it's not newsworthy. So what is it that's making people pick up a newspaper to read it, or to buy it, or, you know, turn on the TV, or click on a story? It doesn't matter. The principles apply similarly across all media. It doesn't really matter about the format. Journalism established that there are these series of news values. So, for example, and prominence is another one. So if you can line up a number of these news values, for example, if Prince Philip does something, then, you know, you've got prominence. If Prince Philip has a fight, then you've got conflict. If Prince Philip does something seriously weird, although, well, okay, so there's a third one, unusualness. So newsrooms, when they have their editorial meetings, they don't kind of list, they don't kind of list these things and say, well, that's got proximity. They say, that's a good yarn, because it's internalised. At Fairfax, the news values emphasise a certain range of things, and it's true that the individual journalists are left-leaning. At News Limited, individual journalists, it's hard to actually say, but the organs are right-leaning. So those news values are different in those different media outlets, and they're culturally that's absorbed. So when you enter as a junior person, it's same at the ABC, when you enter as a cadet or a junior reporter, you look around and you see, who do I respect? And you think, oh, okay, there's, David Marr at Fairfax, or, name your senior reporter in any organisation, and you think, oh, what do they think? And you kind of think, well, if I think like them, I will get ahead, or I will be the kind of person I want to be. And so they're internalised, these values, that they differ from media outlet to media outlet. So just to finish, in terms of coming down with control from on top, because that is another factor, because professional values of journalists are not always realised. So yeah, journalists pitch stories because the editors can't think of them all. When an editor thinks of a story, like, oh wow, what's happening over there? It's called an editor special, and it's sometimes wacky and sometimes not, and you have to do it. But journalists pitch stories, and the editors apply this complex mix, well, not that complex, but a mix of decision-making factors, including news values and including who they're going to piss off. So if they're going to piss off someone, they're careful about that. They may still go ahead and piss people off, because as we know, there is a reasonably robust media in Australia, but there's also plenty of occasions when they won't piss people off. And personally, I think that the most controlled media organisation is News Corp. The least is probably Fairfax, but that's when you're limiting it to the handful of major media organisations. I mean control from the company. So you might say that the control comes from the journalist. That's another thing. And then the ABC, well, I don't think they're top-down controlled. I think what's happening there is more coming out of the collective.
Collective's right.
Maybe it is, but it's a collective
Communist
consensus about the way that they see journalism. In particular, journalism, the public interest role is probably more dominant in the way they think than some people might realise. So, I could love to talk for a long time about media control and stuff, but I'll leave it at that. Thanks.